So to the international newspaper review, Florence Villeneuve here on set, and a possible military operation in Syria, inevitably, I suppose, at the moment, dominating the papers, really.
Absolutely. Let's start with the New York Times, which says that Obama is weighing this limited strikes against the Syrian forces, and points out just what the aim of this operation would be, which is to deter and degrade President Bashar al-Assad's government's ability to launch chemical weapons. The aim is not to oust him from power or to force him to the negotiating table. Now, the New York Times points out that American officials say this would be some sort of a limited operation that wouldn't last more than 1 or 2 days, that would target about 50 sites that the New York Times goes into more detail about. So Tomahawk missiles would target not chemical weapons storage areas as such, but military units that could carry out chemical weapons attacks, as well as headquarters. Now, it's interesting to note that President Obama is getting a lot of attention in the press for the way he's reacting to this whole crisis, and quite a lot of criticism. Here's a cartoon in the International Herald Tribune, for instance, where you see he's saying there that Mr. Assad has boxed himself into a corner behind that red line there, but the person who's really boxed into a corner there, well, is President Obama himself.
Yeah, that's the criticism of Obama. Quite a lot of criticism as well of David Cameron in the British press.
That's right, feeling that he's perhaps being a little too gung-ho here. If we take a look at the front page of The Independent, they call him the heir to Blair, and they take a closer look at the parallels between Iraq in 2003 and Syria today, with key questions like, is the intervention legal? Well, that depends on whose opinion you ask. Are inspectors getting enough time? Well, The Independent says not really. Has Parliament been properly consulted? Well, as in 2003, as in now, The Independent says not really either. Is the party or the public opinion behind Blair or Cameron? Well, that too is not really the case. And especially, are we America's poodle? In both cases, the UK says absolutely not. There's a cartoon in The Independent that also draws a parallel between the war in Iraq in 2003 and the crisis in Syria there. You see the reflection between George Bush, David Cameron, and Blair, etc. And it's not the most flattering of reflections. In fact, The Independent calls this a hall of mirrors that you could find perhaps in a house of horrors.
Okay, well, the other big story in all the newspapers today is 50 years ago, Martin Luther King saying, "I have a dream." Papers across the world paying tribute to that iconic speech today.
That's right, August 28th, 1963. It was also a Wednesday, and Martin Luther King addressed a crowd of 250,000 rather,
yeah.
A lot of people there at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The International Herald Tribune says this, "I have a dream," this riff changed America. Takes a closer look at the speech. That part, the "I have a dream" part, was actually improvised. This was after the folk singer, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. She actually yelled at Martin Luther King during his speech and said, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And that's where he pushed his notes aside and delivered what is now that iconic speech. The Guardian also pays tribute to the speech in their editorial today, says, "Few speeches echo across generations and inspire like this "I have a dream" speech, but speeches can only do so much. 50 years on, the dream remains unfinished business," says The Guardian. So sure, the United States has a black president, but if you look at the everyday lives of African Americans, whether it's the fact that unemployment is twice that of white workers or their lower earnings, the justice system, all this indicates that, well, there's still a lot to do in terms of equality in the U.S.
Other papers, though, as you say, saying there is still an awful lot to do.
That's right. There's a really interesting piece in the Washington Post by Martin Luther King III, who's the eldest son of Martin Luther King Jr. and a human rights advocate. He says that, sure, it's time to celebrate his father's speech, but it's also a time to address the festering injustices of inequality, racism, and poverty in the U.S. And he really addresses what we've been hearing a lot about, which is, of course, the Trayvon Martin case. And he says, well, there's African-American young people still have really good reasons to fear racially motivated violence. He says when an unarmed 17-year-old walking home with Skittles can be brutally slain by an armed man who is then acquitted of all charges, well, something is very wrong. He also talks about the economic situation, etc. He says, I can't help but wonder what my dad would think. And he says, well, he'd hope that they would all work together today.
Who knew that I Had a Dream was improvised? You learn something new every day with Florence Villeneuve with the papers here on France 24. That's the papers then. The very latest news, latest on Syria, of course, coming up right after the break. Do stay with us if you can.